And I think what we wanted to do just on the first day was to acknowledge that over the last couple of years, the learning group has been on a journey. And we've been doing all these different bulletins. They've been coming out each month. People have been sending in case studies, stories. And there's a whole load of learning. There's a frightening amount of words that are already written. And we just wanted to sort of say, okay, this is some of the things that have come out of the last couple of years, which will raise questions for the next period. It doesn't mean they've answered things, but just to give some feedback. About 2,000 years ago, the Roman emperor, Marcus Aurelius, these Romans, they were quite clever, but the Roman emperor Marcus Aurelius said, make a habit of regularly observing the universal process of change. Be assiduous in your attention to it, and school yourself thoroughly in this branch of study. There's nothing more elevating to the mind. So what we're doing this week, there's nothing more elevating, because we're looking at this universal process of change, but we're applying it to churches and to OD. And from these 23 letters, these 20 case studies, these 11 different articles, there's learning at different levels or different topics. There's learnings about OD generally, not specific to churches, not specific to Christian organizations, but they're just professional good practice. And maybe some of those things would answer some of these questions around key aspects of OD practice, best practice. So there's some different elements there that we can talk about. But there's also a whole load of stuff that says, well, okay, we're looking at these distinct and diverse organizations that call themselves churches and Christian organizations. What's different about OD with them as opposed to normal organizations, if any organization is normal? But what's different? What implications does that have? And there's about 5 or 6 of your questions that are sort of around that area. And the third element would be that, okay, we know that churches can be a bit different, and we need to understand what that is. But there's also things around bringing our own individual faith into that process and where God fits into a change process, or where our theology fits into a change process. And there's some questions around that. So what I wanted to sort of do was to present some of the learnings, and the way that I'll present it is using a very simple change model and saying, okay, these are some of the different learnings that we've learned about these different phases. And I'll take you through that. So what we want to do is, okay, let's quickly run through some of the main things that we've learned. And I think the first phase of any change process, for me, or the most important thing, is around assessing motive or understanding motive or interrogating motive. So many change processes seem to start, and it's actually someone else's motive for change. And that's a real challenge. We want this church to change, but they're not changing. So who's got the motive? And so many of the stories and so many of the experiences seem to suggest that actually interrogating the motive for change right at the beginning is absolutely essential. And if the motive for change isn't there, then maybe it's best not to be doing anything at all. I remember a couple of years ago, or about 3 years ago, I was asked to do some work with the Zimbabwe Council of Churches, or I was asked by Church of Sweden and by ECO, said, look, we've got a problem in Zimbabwe with the Council of Churches, can you go and help? And so I said, well, tell me about the General Secretary and tell me about the board. Are they on for change? And they said, no, they're completely set against it. They don't want anything to do with it, and they're the problem. And so I basically said, well, there's nothing I can do, really. Until there's a real motive for change from within, it's very difficult to do anything. So there's a couple of questions here is, how do you motivate an organization to acknowledge? How do I get the leadership of the Bible Society to recognize there's a need for change in the structure here? That motive is really essential, and that's just good practice OD with any organization. but it's the most fundamental thing, and so often we skip beyond that. And linked to that is this thing of building trust as a facilitator, either within or outside or as a donor, in whatever role, but trust is such a critical thing because people change through relationship, and that trust is absolutely key. So there's stuff right probably at the beginning of any change process around motive and trust. And sometimes it's better not to get involved than to get involved and then find you've wasted your time and made things worse. The Zimbabwe thing happened, nothing happened for 2 years. Then they got a completely new board, and the board said to the donors, we want to change, can you help us? And then suddenly the whole thing was opened and unlocked, and so much of change is about timing. And that for me, it's around motive. So that's one thing that comes through really strongly, and probably for me, one of the fundamental lessons. And one of the things that we wanted to explore this week was around leadership and motive for change. And how do we ensure that that motive's there? Again, linked to those questions. So that's some of the stuff that we want to be grappling with. How do we assess whether there's sufficient motive for change? Because motives are always mixed, it's not black or white. So when is there enough and when is there not quite enough? How do we work out? How do we do that assessment? Lots of things like that. The second stage of a change process, again, this is very simplified, so real change processes don't naturally follow this, but it works as a sort of simple model, as long as we recognize that, it can go all sorts of directions here. But it's around gaining understanding. When we go into an organization, or even from within an organization, what's the problem here? What's the diagnosis? What's really happening here? And again, I think one of the things that keeps coming through from all the writings is the importance of understanding, the context that this church, this organization is working in. And they operate within a national context, a local context. They also operate within a religious context. And we need to sort of understand that wider environment in order to really, be able to situate it. I think I loved Anna's question, which recognized that actually it's not just about change in one organization, it's change through a whole system of organizations and an interrelated system of organizations. So we need to see the organization in context, but we also need to see what's really going on in an organization. What you can see above the waterline is the easy bit, and actually maybe give you completely the wrong impression. You read the vision, the value statement, and you think, what could be wrong here? It's beautiful. They love accountability, they love transparency, etc., etc. Or just as with even with a CV, someone sends a CV and it has all sorts of things written in the CV. That tells you a little bit, but it doesn't tell you that much really about a person and whether they're going to fit in to the organization. So we need to, good OD processes really explore what's going on below the waterline. And I like that analogy of a hippo, that actually what you can see above the water is just the top bit. But actually the real hippo, all the weight is underneath. And sometimes you only see what a hippo really looks like at night, when it's dark, when it feels safe, when it comes out to feed. And also I like the analogy for hippos, because if you get in between a hippo and the water and it doesn't feel safe, it'll charge for the water and it'll kill you. And as an OD facilitator, I've been trodden on 1 or 2 times. When you get an organization exposed, they charge and you're in the way. Anyway, but let's try and explore what's really going on below the waterline. And I think church organizations, maybe they're particularly challenging here because we want to put on a veneer that we're Christian, and therefore, we're this, and this. And I think, again, all my experience, and probably all your experiences, is that we have to go into organizations thinking, first and foremost, they are profoundly human. They're not remotely divine. Or maybe remotely, but very, very remotely. But if we assume that they're going to be human, and they're going to be full of human beings and not angels, then then I think we're probably in a much better position to facilitate change and also to understand some of the challenges and some of the dynamics that they face. But if we can't continue or we don't want to sort of collaborate in the sort of thing that everything's fine here because we're Christian. That makes it more difficult. So it means that we have to, we're a Christian organization is just above the waterline. It doesn't say much about what's really happening. So I think one of the tracks, and again, many of the things that we wanted to look at here, is let's get below the waterline of these church organizations, Christian organizations. What are some of the common viruses that they suffer from? What are the common ailments that they have? This thing of leadership, and you've got leadership in any organization is fundamentally important and often very powerful. You throw in a spiritual authority into that, and it just sort of exponentially increases the power and leads to great things and leads to really, really awful things. And again, it's that dilemma. But we can't ignore leadership. Then there's a number of, and what's really interesting actually is if you look at the case studies, most of the stories that have come out of this learning group have been around this next stage. And they're sort of two stages, but they're one stage. They're two sides of the same coin. There's a letting go element to any change process, an unlearning, whatever you want to call it. But there's a recognition that actually to change involves stopping doing certain things. And again, there's whether you call that a repentance thing, but there's an acknowledgement that the way that we've done it in the past hasn't been right. And until there is that sort of sense of pain and taking responsibility for that, then we go, we can do all the planning in the world, but we'll still continue to behave in the same way. And we know that from our personal lives. Just like with these New Year's resolutions, they're not very difficult to make. And they don't involve much pain. And we usually have finished them by mid-January at best, because they've not touched the depth of us, unless you take them really seriously. But so much of the OD stuff that we do seems to remain at the level of New Year's resolutions. We link from gaining understanding to planning to change without actually having gone through this critical process of, first of all, letting go. But the flip side of that, and completely sort of almost integrated with that, but also distinct, is there's a hope, there's a positive thing, there's a good thing. It's the sort of sorrow into joy. And it's just fascinating how many of the stories are around this bit. And how many of this is actually, this is almost where the spiritual stuff seems to come in more strongly. And again, I don't know what that is. Maybe that's something to explore. Is this more professional? Is this where the spiritual stuff comes in more? I'm not sure. I was interested, who was it? Joyce was saying that she'd facilitated a number of strategic funerals in OD. I think that's great. There's so few organizations that are prepared to die. And yet, actually, that would be that, death is a part of life. Everything has got a time and a season, and many organizations seem to find it very difficult to die. We all do. And that's, again, that's a human natural reaction. But sometimes as OD people, what we're here for is to help them to die, and to help them to die with dignity, and to help that death not create so much problems for the beneficiaries. And that can be a really, really valuable role to play. So I'm pleased Joyce can tell us how to do that. My experience is that they always, they keep saying, but and I think again it's a challenge for donors. Sometimes, we keep organizations on expensive life support machines, when actually it would be better not to put them on, just invest the money in new things. But anyway, that's a different thing.